Mira stood at the edge of the crystal cliff and felt the world shaking beneath her feet. The three suns of Valorian Prime were climbing higher in the sky, but their light seemed dim and broken through the smoke that was rising from the cities far below. She had been born in those cities. She had walked through the singing gardens where flowers bloomed only when music was played nearby. She had learned magic in the crystal towers where the greatest teachers of her people had lived for thousands of years. Now all of that was turning to ash and disappearing forever into the sky. The sound came first before Mira could see anything, a low humming noise that made her teeth ache and her pointed ears twitch with pain. Then the sky split open like someone tearing apart cloth. Massive ships descended through the clouds, each one as large as mountains made of metal and fire. These were the ships of the Collective, the empire that consumed planets and left nothing behind but empty rocks and dead soil. Mira had heard the warnings since she was a child playing in the gardens, but she never truly believed it would happen to her world. She never thought the Collective would come here to destroy everything. Her three dragons sensed her fear through the invisible bond that connected them across the distance. Zephyr was the oldest dragon, his scales dark as midnight and his eyes as wise as the oldest mountains in the world. Storm was younger, with bright emerald green scales that caught the light of the three suns and glowed like precious jewels. Frostbite was the smallest of the three, but also the fastest, with scales that sparkled like ice and fresh snow on frozen mountain peaks. All three dragons suddenly took flight from where they had been resting peacefully in the sacred valley miles away. They flew toward Mira with such speed that they created sonic booms that echoed across the land and made the ground shake. The machines from the sky began their terrible work of destruction. Laser beams cut through the air like swords made of pure light and burning heat. Buildings that had been standing for 10,000 years exploded into dust in seconds. The crystal tower of the first king crumbled like sand on a beach. The great library, where all the knowledge of the elves was stored, burst into flames that reached toward the sky. Mira saw everything she loved and everything her people had built being destroyed right before her eyes. She felt tears on her cheeks, hot and painful. But she could not look away from the devastation happening below her. Zephyr landed beside her on the cliff with a force that cracked the stone beneath his massive claws. The old dragon was breathing heavily, his nostrils flaring with hot smoke that smelled of burnt metal. His eyes looked at Mira with an expression that was both fierce and deeply sad. Through their connection, Zephyr showed her images of other elves running through the streets screaming in terror, of families trying to escape in small ships that exploded before they could leave the ground, of soldiers fighting against machines that could not be stopped. Many of her people were already dead. Many more would die before this day ended. Mira knew what she had to do without hesitation. She climbed onto Zephyr's back and wrapped her arms tightly around his neck. Storm and Frostbite moved to either side of the great dragon, their wings spreading wide and ready for flight. Without any words passing between them, they launched into the burning sky together. Mira held tight as wind rushed past her face at incredible speed. Below them, the destruction continued like a terrible storm that nothing could stop or slow down. They flew across lands that Mira had known her entire life and loved deeply. The green forests where she had played as a child were now burning with flames that reached high into the air. The crystal caves where her people mined gems for their magic were collapsing under bombardment from the sky. The singing rivers where elves had bathed and celebrated life were now black with smoke and ash. Everything beautiful was becoming ugly and broken. Everything peaceful was becoming violent and destructive. The world that Mira loved was dying slowly and painfully. Hours passed as they flew toward the mountains of solitude. These ancient mountains had been holy to the elves since the beginning of their civilization thousands of years ago. The peaks were so high that they seemed to touch the stars themselves hanging in the darkness of space. Between the mountains were valleys that most creatures could never find, because they existed in places where the normal world bent and folded. Mira knew these paths because her grandmother had taught her when she was just 7 years old, sitting by the fire. Zephyr led them through the dimensional folds that only elves and dragons could perceive and understand. The air around them seemed to shimmer and shift in ways that hurt the eyes. Space bent in ways that made no sense but also felt completely natural to those who knew the ancient magic. Storm and Frostbite flew close to Zephyr, trusting completely in his ancient wisdom to guide them safely through these strange paths between worlds. Mira could feel the power of the old magic flowing through everything around her like water flowing in a river. Ancient magic that the Collective, with all their machines and weapons, could never understand or control. They emerged into a vast hidden valley surrounded by 3 towering peaks of crystal. and stone that seemed to touch the clouds themselves. The sunlight filtered through in strange ways, creating rainbows of color that danced across the ground and made everything beautiful. In the center of the valley stood a magnificent chamber made entirely of crystal that glowed with soft blue light like a beacon of hope. This was the sanctuary, the sacred place where her people came in times of greatest danger and need. It had been sealed for thousands of years, waiting for this moment to come. Mira slid down from Zephyr's back and walked toward the crystal chamber with determination in every step. Her hands moved through ancient gestures that her grandmother had taught her long ago in secret lessons. She spoke words in the old tongue, the language of power that the first elves had used to shape the world when creation was new. The words felt strange on her tongue because few elves spoke the old tongue anymore, but they came to her like she had been practicing them every day of her life. The crystal wall began to glow brighter and brighter until it was almost too bright to look at. A doorway opened where solid stone had been just moments before. Inside, Mira could see a vast space filled with supplies and ancient knowledge collected over millennia. There were books and scrolls and artifacts made from magic itself and moonlight. There was food and water that had been preserved by enchantments that kept things fresh forever and never spoiled. This was where the survivors would come when they escaped. This was where they would be safe from the machines and weapons of the collective. This was where her people would hide from the invaders until they could fight back. But as Mira looked back at the sky where smoke was rising from distant explosions that lit up the afternoon like terrible fireworks, she knew that hiding alone was not enough. The collective would eventually find this place if she did nothing. They would search every mountain and every cave and every hiding place until there were no elves left alive anywhere. She could not allow her people to simply wait to be discovered and destroyed. She had to do something. She had to find a way to fight back against the machines. The three dragons gathered around her, their massive heads lowering so that they could be close to their bonded companion. Mira placed her hands on their snouts and felt the warmth of their breath against her silver skin. She could feel their courage and their loyalty running through the connection like electricity. She could feel their willingness to follow her anywhere, even into danger and possible death. In that moment, Mira knew what she had to do and made her decision. She had to reach beyond her world and find help from someone she had never met before. She had to contact the Earth Alliance and tell them what the collective was doing to her people. She had to find a way to bring hope back to her dying world before it was too late. Mira walked deep into the sanctuary until she reached the communication chamber, hidden in the deepest part of the structure. This was a room that had been hidden away for centuries by ancient elves, a place where the ancient elves had sent messages across the stars to other civilizations in distant galaxies far away. The walls were lined with crystals that could pick up signals from across the galaxy and across time itself. At the center of the room was a great sphere of pure light that seemed to hold infinite knowledge within it like a captured star. Mira placed both her hands on the sphere and closed her eyes tightly. She had only learned to use this device once before, when her grandmother had shown her as a final lesson before she passed away peacefully in her sleep. The sphere grew warm beneath her hands and the warmth spread through her entire body like fire and ice mixed together. Energy flowed through her body and she felt connected to every star and every planet in the galaxy. She could sense the vast distances between worlds stretching out like an ocean, but she could also sense life and intelligence existing on countless worlds scattered across space. Mira searched through the connections with her mind, looking for the Earth Alliance and their ships. She could feel them like distant stars burning in the darkness. She focused all her will on reaching them across the impossible distances between worlds, on sending them a message that would travel faster than light. A human woman, AP. Grace Morrison sat in her captain's chair on the bridge of the Earth Alliance warship and tried to make sense of what had just happened in front of her. She had been receiving distress signals from across the galaxy for months and months, but she had never experienced anything like that communication. An elf woman with silver skin and pointed ears had appeared right in front of her, through some kind of ancient communication device that should not even exist. The woman had spoken clearly about her world being invaded and her people being destroyed by the collective forces. Grace had listened to every word carefully and heard the desperation and strength mixed together in the elf's voice. The image had been so real that Grace felt like she could reach out and touch the woman through the sphere. She had seen the despair in the elf's eyes and also the fierce determination to save her people. Grace had seen the dragons in the background, massive creatures with scales that reflected light like jewels. The entire communication had lasted only minutes, but it had changed everything for Grace in those few moments. Now Grace had to make a decision that could change her career forever. The Earth Alliance protocols were clear in the rulebook. Do not interfere with civilizations outside the protected zones, unless there was strategic advantage for the Alliance. Valorian Prime was far from their space and outside their territory. The Collective had already claimed it according to their territorial agreements signed many years ago. By rights, the Earth Alliance should ignore the plea for help from the Elf Woman. Nobody would blame them if they did nothing. But Grace had never been good at following orders when people were suffering and dying. She had joined the military to protect life, not to ignore it when the cost became too high. She had seen too many worlds consumed by the Collective and too many civilizations destroyed. She had watched helplessly as species that had existed for thousands of years were wiped out in weeks. She was tired of sitting on the sidelines and doing nothing while genocide happened in distant places. She called her first officer, Lieutenant Thomas Wade, to the captain's chair immediately. Thomas had served with Grace for 5 years, and he knew her well enough to recognize the look in her eyes. He knew that look meant she was about to make a decision that would get them all in trouble with command and headquarters. Thomas was a tall man with dark hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. He had been a soldier long enough to know when something important was about to happen. Grace explained the situation to him carefully. She told him about the communication from the elf woman named Mira. She told him about the invasion happening on Valorian Prime right now. She told him that they needed to travel to Valorian Prime immediately to provide support and military assistance. She told him that she knew it was against protocol, but she could not sit here and do nothing while an entire civilization was being destroyed. Thomas listened to everything, and then he smiled slightly. He said that he had always wondered what it would be like to fight the Collective directly in a real battle, instead of watching from a distance, and now they would finally find out. He said that he was tired of following orders that made him feel like he was abandoning people in need. He began giving orders to the navigation team immediately, without waiting for confirmation from headquarters. The warship changed course toward Valorian Prime at maximum speed. There was no turning back now. They were committed to helping an alien civilization that they had never met before, and knew nothing about except what one woman had told them through a communication sphere. It was dangerous and it was against protocol, and it could get them all court-martialed and removed from service. But it was the right thing to do, and both Grace and Thomas knew it in their hearts. Grace stood and walked to the viewport where she could see the stars stretching out before her in the darkness of space. Somewhere out there, beyond the vast distances between worlds, a silver-skinned elf woman was waiting and hoping for help to arrive in time. Grace had made a promise through the sphere, and she intended to keep it no matter what the cost might be. She had a feeling that meeting Mira would change everything in her life. She had a feeling that this was the beginning of something extraordinary and new. She did not know then that she was about to meet someone who would change her life forever and transform her completely. She did not know that she would fall in love with an elf woman from a distant world and a different civilization. She only knew that she had to get to Valorian Prime and she had to help Mira survive the invasion. The journey through space would take 7 days of constant travel. It was 7 days of wondering if she was making the right decision and if anyone would understand why she did this. It was 7 days of hoping that Mira and her dragons would stay safe until the warship could arrive. It was 7 days of imagining what this mysterious elf woman would be like in person and how they would work together. Grace spent those 7 days preparing her crew for what might be coming. She held briefing after briefing about the Collective and their tactics in battle. She taught her soldiers everything she knew about fighting against superior numbers and advanced weapons. She prepared them mentally and physically for what might be the most dangerous mission of their lives. Some of the crew questioned her decision to divert to Valorian Prime. Some of them were scared of what they might face when they arrived, but most of them followed her because they trusted her and believed in what she was doing. On the night before arrival, Grace sat alone in her quarters and looked at a photo of her family back on Earth. She thought about her mother and father and her younger brother. She thought about how she had joined the military to protect people like them from threats like the Collective. She thought about how Mira's family was dying right now while she sat in a comfortable chair in space. She thought about how every hour that passed meant more elves were being killed and more of their civilization was being destroyed. Grace made a promise to herself that night. She promised that she would do everything in her power to help Mira and her people. She promised that she would fight against the Collective with everything she had. She promised that she would not let another civilization fall to destruction if she could prevent it. She promised that whatever connection had formed between her and Mira through that communication sphere was real and meant something important. When the warship finally broke through the atmosphere of Valorian Prime 7 days later, Grace stood at the viewport and watched the world below with shock and horror. It was burning and broken, filled with massive machines and structures of the collective all across the surface. Entire regions had been turned into mining operations with nothing left but scarred earth. Cities that had once been beautiful were now ruins and rubble. Grace could see the devastation from space, and it made her heart ache for what Mira and her people were experiencing. But somewhere down there in the hidden mountains, Mira was waiting. And Grace knew that no matter what happened next, no matter what they had to fight or what they had to sacrifice, she would protect that remarkable elf woman and her world. She could feel it in her bones and in her soul. This mission had stopped being about military strategy and protocol and galactic politics. It had become personal in the deepest way possible. Grace contacted the hidden coordinates that Mira had given her and descended her shuttle toward the Mountains of Solitude. As she flew closer, she could see the strange way the mountains seemed to fold in on themselves, the dimensional distortions that made her instruments go crazy. This was alien technology beyond anything she had ever seen before, ancient technology that was far more advanced than anything humans had created. She realized that Mira's people were not primitive aliens that needed human protection. They were an incredibly advanced civilization that had survived for thousands of years through wisdom and magic, an understanding of forces that humans were only beginning to discover. This knowledge made Grace even more determined to help them. She was not going to rescue some backward species. She was going to be an ally to people who were her equals in many ways. She was going to stand beside them and fight the collective as a partner, not a savior. This realization changed how she felt about what she was doing. It made the mission feel even more important and more meaningful. The shuttle landed in the hidden valley, and Grace emerged into a world that seemed to belong to a dream or a fantasy story. The crystal formations glowed with their own light, creating rainbows and patterns that shifted as she watched. The air was cool and clear and smelled like something she could not identify but found beautiful. This was a place of magic and ancient power, a place where her human technology seemed primitive and clumsy. And then she saw the dragons. Grace Morrison stood at the bottom of the ramp and watched as 3 enormous dragons flew directly toward her at incredible speed. Her military training told her to be cautious and alert, because these were creatures that could easily kill her with a single swipe of their massive claws. Her hands instinctively moved toward the weapon at her side. But when she saw the silver-skinned elf woman riding on the largest dragon, all her caution fell away like autumn leaves in the wind. Mira was beautiful in a way that transcended her alien appearance and her pointed ears and her silver skin. Her eyes held ancient wisdom and fierce determination mixed together. Her face showed strength and courage, but also vulnerability and gentleness. Grace knew in that moment that everything had changed. The mission was no longer about military strategy or galactic politics. It was about protecting this remarkable woman and her dying world. It was about something far more personal and important than anything she had experienced in her entire life. The dragons landed in a semicircle around Grace in a coordinated maneuver that showed perfect teamwork and intelligence. They did not attack or growl threateningly. Instead, Zephyr lowered his great head in what seemed like a gesture of respect and greeting. Mira slid down from the dragon's back with graceful movement and walked toward Grace across the Crystal Valley floor. The 2 women stood facing each other across a distance that seemed both vast and infinitesimal at the same time. They stared at each other in silence for a moment that felt like an eternity stretching out between them. Mira extended her hand in the human gesture of greeting that she had learned from ancient recordings. Grace reached out and took it, feeling the cool smoothness of the elf's silver skin against her own warm human flesh. The sensation was electric and shocking. It felt like touching something sacred and beautiful. As their hands connected, both women knew that their meeting was destiny. They knew that they were meant to find each other in the chaos of war and destruction. They knew that together they could accomplish things that neither could achieve alone. Grace's mouth went dry and she found it hard to speak. Mira seemed to be experiencing similar difficulty because her pointed ears were turning slightly red, which Grace found absolutely fascinating. Finally, Grace managed to speak, and she said hello and welcomed them to the Earth Alliance forces. Mira responded with formal greetings in the human language. But underneath the formal words, something deeper was passing between them. A recognition, a connection that transcended species and culture and worlds. The dragons sensed it too, and they let out a sound that was part song and part roar, a celebration of the connection that had just been formed. Zephyr released a burst of flame that lit up the valley with golden light. Storm and Frostbite created harmonies with their calls that echoed across the mountains. The three sons of Valorian Prime shone down on them, bathing the moment in light and possibility and hope for the future. Thomas Wade descended the ramp after Mira had landed with the dragons. He was carrying a portable holographic display device that would allow them to show tactical information about the collective positions. Thomas set up the display and showed Mira a map of Valorian Prime with the locations of known collective forces marked in red. The machines had spread further than Mira had feared. They were now covering nearly a third of the planet's surface. Grace studied the map carefully, and then she asked Mira what her people needed most urgently. Mira explained that they needed to evacuate as many elves as possible to safety. She said that the sanctuary could hold a few hundred more people, but eventually they would need to establish more refugees or find a way off the planet. Grace said that her warship could take at least 1,000 people if they packed efficiently. She asked Mira if she thought the collective knew about the hidden location of the sanctuary. Mira said that it was hard to know for certain, but the dimensional folds that protected the valley should prevent the collective sensors from detecting it. However, if they started moving large groups of elves through the mountains toward the landing zone, the movement patterns might draw attention. They would need to be very careful and very strategic about how they proceeded. Grace and Thomas began working with Mira and some of the older elves to develop a plan. They realized that they could not simply evacuate everyone they wanted to, because the collective would detect the large movement patterns. Instead, they would need to do multiple evacuation runs over time. They would need to be careful and patient and willing to work in stages, even though every moment they waited meant more people might die. Grace suggested that they attack a collective outpost to draw the collective forces away from the mountains. If the collective was focused on defending or responding to an attack, they would have less attention to spare for monitoring the hidden valley. Mira was hesitant about direct military action, but she realized that it might be necessary. She asked Grace if her forces were strong enough to fight the collective machines without suffering excessive casualties. Grace said that her crew and weapons were advanced and well-trained. She said that they could not win a long-term conflict against the collective because the collective had endless resources and reinforcements, but they could win short-term tactical engagements if they were careful. They could hit specific targets and then retreat before collective reinforcements could respond. She said that the goal would not be to destroy the collective completely, but to buy time for evacuations and to show the elves that they had a fighting chance. Over the next hours, the two groups planned their strategy together. They decided on a target that was far enough from the hidden valley that an attack would not draw collective attention toward the sanctuary, but close enough that it was strategically important. The target was a collective mining complex that was processing minerals from what had once been the city of Starlight. By attacking this facility, they could destroy valuable resources and demonstrate that there was resistance capable of hurting the collective. Mira brought Grace to meet Carrion and the other elder elves who had been leading the refugee groups. They gathered in the crystal chamber, and Grace explained the military situation as she understood it. She said that the collective would likely send more reinforcements to Valorian Prime as soon as they realized there was resistance here. She said that they had maybe 1 week before the situation became impossible. She said that they needed to act quickly but carefully. Carrion and the other elders asked Grace many questions about the Earth Alliance. They wanted to know about the Alliance's strength and their long-term goals and whether they could be trusted. Grace answered all their questions honestly. She told them about the Alliance's commitment to stopping the collective expansion. She told them about the long history of worlds and civilizations that had joined together to resist the collective. She told them that she and her crew were here because they believed in the cause and because they believed that Mira was telling the truth about what was happening. One of the elders named Arion asked Grace directly if she had come to this world because it was strategically valuable or because she cared about saving the elves. Grace considered the question carefully before answering. She said that strategically, Valorian Prime was not particularly valuable to the Earth Alliance. She said that she had come because an elf woman had sent a desperate cry for help across the stars, and she could not ignore that call. She said that she had come because she believed that every life mattered, and that no civilization should be left to die if there was any way to save them. Her answer seemed to satisfy the elders. They agreed to work with Grace and her forces on the attack plan and on the evacuation strategy. They agreed to help coordinate which elves would be evacuated in which groups and when. They agreed to prepare the sanctuary for the possibility that collective forces might eventually discover its location. As the meeting concluded, Mira and Grace found themselves standing together away from the others. Grace reached out and took Mira's hand gently. She said that she wanted Mira to know that she understood the weight of leadership and the burden of responsibility. She said that she had made similar hard decisions in her military career, and she knew how it felt to make choices where any option meant that some people would suffer. She said that Mira was doing everything right, and that she should not blame herself for the things that were beyond her control. Mira felt tears forming in her eyes. She said that she was grateful for Grace's support and understanding. She said that she had been so focused on surviving and protecting her people that she had not allowed herself to feel anything else. She said that meeting Grace had changed something inside her. She said that for the first time since the invasion began, she felt like she was not alone in carrying the burden. Grace pulled Mira into an embrace and held her tightly. Neither woman spoke, but they both understood that something important was happening between them. This was more than alliance. This was the beginning of a bond that would change both of their lives forever. The dragons watched from across the valley and seemed to understand the significance of the moment. They made soft rumbling sounds that seemed almost like approval and encouragement. The planning for the attack on the collective mining complex took 2 full days of careful preparation. Grace worked closely with Thomas Wade and several other human officers to develop the tactical approach. Mira worked with Carrion and the elf warriors to understand how they could contribute their magical abilities to the mission. The goal was to create a coordinated assault that would damage the facility significantly, while minimizing casualties on both sides. Grace showed Mira advanced holographic projections of the mining complex layout. She pointed out the locations of energy generators and processing equipment and storage facilities. She explained that if they could destroy the central power core, they could shut down the entire complex. Thomas showed drone footage that had been collected during reconnaissance missions. The footage showed hundreds of robotic workers moving constantly, mining and processing minerals under the control of a central AI command structure. Mira explained that the collective machines operated through a networked command system. If they could disrupt the central control nodes, the machines might malfunction or stop functioning entirely. She said that her people had limited experience with electronic sabotage, but they did have magical abilities that might be able to create electromagnetic pulses or disrupt power systems. Carrion confirmed this and said that he could teach some of the younger elves a spell of disruption that had been used in ancient wars to disable enemy weapons. The strategy began to take shape. The human forces would approach the facility from the north and attack the defensive perimeter. This would draw the collective forces out to respond to the threat. While the humans were engaging the collective machines in combat, Mira and the elf warriors would approach from a different direction, using the dragons for rapid transport. They would land on the facility and move toward the central control core. Once there, Carrion and the trained elves would cast the disruption spell while Mira and the warriors provided protection against any guards or automated defense systems. The risks were significant. Many people could die in this attack, but Grace and Mira both understood that they had to try. Every day they waited, more elves were being killed by the collective and more of their civilization was being destroyed. They had to act despite the danger. They had to try to make a difference. On the eve of the attack, Grace and Mira walked together through the Crystal Valley. The 3 suns of Valorian Prime were setting, creating spectacular colors across the sky. Red and orange and gold mixed together in ways that seemed almost magical. The dragons were resting peacefully, sensing the tension and the danger that tomorrow would bring. Zephyr opened one ancient eye as the women approached, but he did not move from where he lay. Grace and Mira sat on the crystal formations and watched the sky change colors as the suns set one by one. Neither of them spoke at first. They just sat together in comfortable silence, drawing strength from each other's presence. Finally, Grace asked Mira what she wanted most if they managed to survive this war and save her people. Mira thought about the question carefully before answering. Mira said that she wanted her world to be beautiful again. She wanted the forest to grow back green and the rivers to sing again. She wanted her people to rebuild their cities and their culture. She said that she wanted to spend time learning and teaching instead of fighting and surviving. She said that most of all, she wanted to know that it was possible to build peace between different species and different worlds. She wanted to believe that humans and elves could work together and create something beautiful, instead of just working together to fight against enemies. Grace said that she wanted the same things. She said that she had spent so much of her life focused on military strategy and combat operations. She said that she wanted to believe that there could be peace in the galaxy someday. She said that meeting Mira had given her hope that this was possible. She said that Mira and her people had shown her that there were other ways of thinking and being in the universe. She said that she had learned more from Mira in a few days than she had learned in years of military service. As they talked, the darkness deepened, and the stars began to appear in the sky. The stars of Valorian Prime's home system were different from the stars visible from Earth, but they were equally beautiful. Grace reached over and took Mira's hand. This time it was not a formal greeting. It was personal and intimate. Mira did not pull away. Instead, she leaned closer to Grace and rested her head on the human woman's shoulder. They sat like that for hours as the night deepened. Neither of them knew if this might be the last time they would ever sit together like this. Tomorrow brought danger and the possibility of death. But tonight they had this moment. They had this connection. They had this proof that even in the darkest times and across the vast differences between species and worlds, two people could find love and understanding. The dragons seemed to understand the significance of the moment. They lifted their heads and made soft sounds that were almost like songs. The sounds echoed across the valley and seemed to carry blessing and encouragement. Frostbite moved closer and gently rested her head near where Grace and Mira sat. Storm and Zephyr followed, creating a protective circle of dragon bodies around the two women. The dragons understood that Mira and Grace had bonded, and they approved of this union. When morning came, both women felt a sense of calm determination. They had said goodbye to each other without using words. They had made peace with the possibility of death. They had faced their fears and their love for each other openly. Now they were ready to fight. Now they were ready to do what needed to be done. The attack on the mining complex began as the three suns climbed higher in the sky. Grace's human forces moved into position and began their assault on the northern perimeter of the facility. Laser fire erupted as the Earth Alliance warship launched weapons and her ground forces engaged the collective defensive systems. Explosions lit up the mining complex as the human weapons found their targets. The collective machines responded immediately to the attack. Defensive lasers began firing back at the human forces. Automated turrets rotated and targeted the incoming attack positions. Robotic soldiers began moving toward the human soldiers to engage them in direct combat. The battle was fierce and intense. Both sides suffered casualties, but the human forces were holding their position against the collective response. While the human forces engaged the collective attention, Mira and the elf warriors prepared to move. They climbed onto the backs of the three dragons. Zephyr carried Mira and two of the elder warriors. Storm and Frostbite carried Carrion and the young elves who had been trained to cast the disruption spell. The dragons took flight from the hidden valley and flew toward the mining complex, moving quickly and staying low to avoid detection by collective sensors. The dragons landed on top of the processing facility, and the elves dismounted quickly. They moved through the facility corridors toward the central control core. Mira could feel the vibrations of the battle happening outside the structure. She could hear the sounds of explosions and weapons fire. She knew that Grace and her forces were fighting and possibly dying to give them this chance to strike at the heart of the facility. They encountered resistance as they moved deeper into the complex. Robotic guards emerged from side passages and attempted to stop them. The elf warriors used their weapons and magic to overcome the guards. Carrion led a group that used the disruption spell to damage power systems and disable automated defenses. They moved slowly but steadily toward their objective. Finally, they reached the central control core. It was a massive chamber filled with enormous computer equipment and energy generators. At the center stood a tall crystalline structure that seemed to be the heart of the entire operation. Carrion and his trained elves moved into formation around the crystal. They began chanting in the old tongue, the language of ancient power. Their hands moved through gestures that had been taught to them by Carrion over days of intense training. The disruption spell began to take effect. The crystal structure cracked and then shattered into pieces. The equipment throughout the chamber began to malfunction and shut down. Power systems failed and backup systems activated and then also failed. The entire facility's control systems collapsed as the elves completed their spell. Outside, the human forces detected the sudden power failure and the shutdown of collective defensive systems. Grace gave the signal for her forces to push deeper into the facility and complete the destruction. Human soldiers moved in with explosives and destroyed key equipment. They systematically eliminated the ability of the mining complex to function. Within 30 minutes, the facility was completely destroyed. The collective machines stopped functioning. The robotic workers became inert and lifeless. The mining equipment ceased operation. The facility that had been processing Valorian Prime's resources for the collective was now nothing but a dead shell of twisted metal and burnt equipment.